To discuss American foreign policy after the election, we're joined from North Carolina, where it's late evening Wednesday still, by Professor Bruce Jentleson. Bruce is Professor of Public Policy and Political Science at Duke University. Earlier this year, he was based in Canberra as the Des Ball Chair at the College of Asia and the Pacific at ANU. He's got a very extensive resume, apart from being a prolific author, among other roles. He's been Senior Advisor to the State Department Policy Planning Director. In 2016, he was Chair of a Hillary Clinton Foreign Policy Working Group. It's a pleasure to have such an expert join us at such an interesting time. Bruce, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll hand straight across to you.
Great. Well, thanks very much to Alistair and the Institute for the invitation, and also to Michelle Ferreira at the Coral Bell School at ANU, who I worked with while I was in Australia on outreach and communication, and has been a great colleague in both producing the report on which this talk is based and in helping us connect for this presentation. I will say I greatly enjoyed being at ANU. I actually knew Desmond Ball when I was a younger professor, and he was a very renowned professor internationally. We did have to cut our stay short. In fact, around the middle of March, I gave a public lecture at ANU, initial take on this topic about foreign policy in the election. And we still were at 150 people there. We're not shaking hands, doing elbows, but not yet cracking down. And of course, the funny part, my grown children were back in the United States where it was hitting harder. And there was this role reversal, right? There's saying, Mom and Dad, you need to get home. We said, why? We're really enjoying Australia, but we did eventually have to leave early, much to our chagrin. And I will say that that somehow YouTube and the algorithms kept up with my watching of the Australian ABC News. And so I keep getting YouTube algorithms with some of the news. So I've been able to keep up with affairs, including your efforts, much more successful than ours with COVID. I can't say I've had a lot of sleep since yesterday. It's been an adventure. But I will say, as Alistair said, I've worked for Democratic administrations. My goal tonight really is to try to be more analytic than an advocate. But in 2000, when I was serving as a senior foreign policy advisor to Vice President Al Gore and his campaign, a little bit of preparation for what we're going through now. I was in Nashville on election night, and one of my roles was to do interviews with the foreign press. And I just did an interview with a then relatively unknown Middle East network called Al Jazeera, and was interviewing with BBC when it was announced that we had won Florida. And the BBC reporter said something like, oh, you're going to win the presidency now. And I babbled something like, well, it's a country with lots of time zones. Well, 20 minutes later, they took Florida away from us. And the rest of the evening went on in a very confusing way. And indeed, this went on for 5 weeks until December 13th, I believe it was, when the Supreme Court made a decision. And we were going through, there'd be a court decision that would make it look like we were going to win. And I'd get a call from Vice President's principal foreign policy aide saying, we need to work up lists for, major appointments. We'd work on lists to start getting ready. And then 3 days later, there'd be another court decision in the other direction. We'd say, why are we doing this for some archival box someday? I will say at the end of that period, after the Supreme Court decision, Vice President Al Gore, despite some pressure going the other direction, accepted the decision, very much as what we won't call an institutionalist, even though he didn't totally agree with it, the way that Florida was decided then, but believed that the sanctity of the system was more important than the results of his election. And that was that. And of course, I'll also say that evening there was quite a party at the Vice President's house where everybody just kind of, nothing illicit, but everybody kind of let their stress out, and just sort of a way of communing at the last moment. So we are going through an interesting period now, and I'm not sure what's ahead. I'll try to talk some to that. So let me first talk a little bit about the analytics, because we really aren't after the election just yet. And then really talk about what I think foreign policy implications are with a few issues, not go through the whole agenda, but really then leave enough time for questions that I can address issues that you have. So let me at least we can put up, Alistair's going to help me put up a map of the Electoral College. And for those of you, who know our system, that the presidential election really isn't one election, it's 50 different elections in each state, because it's largely a winner take all in each state. Whoever gets the majority, even by, as in Florida back in 2000, 547 votes, gets all those votes. This is where things stand now. The blue are states that have been projected to go for Vice President Biden. Excuse me, he's at 253 Electoral College votes. Late today, our time, Wisconsin and Michigan were put in his column. You can see they're shaded in that way. Donald Trump has 214. The magic number is 270. And the states that are in gray, Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia, and actually Alaska off the map. Those are the ones that they're still counting. There was an enormous amount of mail-in and early voting as COVID restrictions. And the pattern, not to anybody's surprise, was that Democrats did a lot more of the early voting because they were taking COVID more seriously. And a lot of the same day voting went for President Trump. Basically, Joe Biden either needs to win Pennsylvania, which has 20 Electoral College votes to get over 270, we put him at 273, or any two of the other states. The numbers in Nevada and Arizona look particularly good, both in themselves for what the margin is that Vice President Biden has and where the missing votes are coming from. They're coming from Arizona, the Phoenix area, Nevada, the Las Vegas area, which tend to be heavily Democratic. Georgia has kind of gotten tighter than it was this morning. A lot of votes around the Atlanta area. If Vice President Biden wins Nevada and Arizona loses the others, he'll be at exactly 270. And I don't want to get too much into it. I'm happy to elaborate later if people want, but there are ways in which the electors, when they actually meet in early January, don't absolutely necessarily have to stay with the vote in their state. Occasionally it's happened, the elector goes the other way and it was not consequential, so it was no big deal. But let's just say one can imagine any number of scenarios. I don't consider this president an institutionalist. He's already indicated, trying efforts to discredit the system and the election and the vote. There could be elector defection. So we've got a lot ahead of us between now and when things are finally signed, sealed, and delivered in early January. If Vice President Biden were to win a bunch of these states and get up to 290 or 300, then that becomes a lot less likely. But if he's at 270 and only one elector could make it 269, 269, you can sort of let your imagination, doesn't even have to run away to think about the scenarios. The other point I'll make is one of our real concerns in this country is civil political violence. We've seen a significant amount of it. There was a plot uncovered to kidnap the governor of Michigan because of her COVID crackdown plot. I know there was some dissent in Victoria, but to my knowledge, nobody was kidnapping Mr. Andrews. And so I'm a bit worried about what may happen, even if it's not necessarily triggered by statements from the president. There's a lot of political violence and, as you know, a lot of guns in our country. So we should know the count within the next few days. We may know it tomorrow. We probably will know it by the end of the week. But the transition period until January 20th is going to be just a lot of things can happen. Just a couple other points about the election and move on to foreign policy. One is the polls were yet again quite inaccurate. I mean, Wisconsin, for example, some polls had Biden ahead by as much as 15 or 17 percentage points, and he's winning by 20,000 votes. They were inaccurate in 2016. I know the polls in the UK on Brexit were inaccurate. I know a number of Israeli elections have had inaccurate polls. There's a real methodology issue with polls. I think I'm right that the recent New Zealand election, the polls were pretty accurate with the outcome. I'm sorry, I don't recall what happened in your most recent election in Australia. But there's all sorts of methodological issues, but the polls were wrong, even though they said Biden was going to win. He's winning in a lot closer election than they predicted. One factor was our turnout. Our voting was very high for the United States. Again, the number will change a little bit, but right now it's at 65.7% of registered voters. Now, that's a lot lower than other countries, but it's high for the United States. In 2016, it was 55.5%. Low water mark was 1996, Bill Clinton against Bob Dole, 49%. President Obama in 2008, then Senator Obama, got 62.8%, the excitement of the Obama candidacy. 2012 was a little lower. So turnout was very high on both sides. Trump actually mobilized more voters. Some people thought that everybody who was going to vote for Trump in 2006 would have done so in 2016. He added about 3.7 million votes this time. Some of them are new voters. They turn 18. And Biden got about 5.2 million votes over what Hillary Clinton got. The Senate did not go for the Democrats, and most predictions were that it would. It almost certain, there's still some uncertainty, will be a Republican majority. And I know there are problems with coalition governments and parliamentary systems, but in our system of separation of powers and checks and balances, you will have a Democratic House, a Republican Senate led by Mitch McConnell, who was rather famous for his statement in 2009 at President Obama's inauguration that he was determined to make sure Obama was a one-term president. Didn't succeed at that. So we'll have to see how the branches work together if Biden, in fact, is president and the Senate is Republican. So we can move aside from the election information now, and just we can come back and talk about why what happened. But I think let me just make one point there, and then I'm happy to answer other questions about it. Whatever the outcome, and I obviously, am a pro-Biden person. American politics have deeper political dynamics that are very problematic. If you use the analogy of currencies in the foreign exchange markets, and if they fluctuate within a certain band, things are fine. If they go outside that band, then you get into depreciation or other measures. American politics over the last 20 plus years have actually not stayed within the band of normal fluctuation of politics. If you go back to 1998, there was an effort to impeach Bill Clinton. 2019 to impeach Donald Trump, 2 impeachment efforts. We've only had 4 in our history. In 2000, we had the election I talked about with Al Gore and George Bush, not to go to the Supreme Court. 2003, we went to war in Iraq, a war that at least many in the world opposed. The 2007-2009 financial crisis, which was largely, unlike other crises that emanated from elsewhere, was driven by American financial markets. Then in 2016, we go to, much of the world liked it, but we go to, an extreme, as many people saw, of electing an African-American Barack Obama president. In 2016, come back and elect, somebody very, very different in Donald Trump. So the question that I've been asked a lot by international colleagues is, many are happy that Biden will be president, but what's going to happen in your 2022 midterm elections or your 2024 next presidential election? Will you stay within that band of fluctuation? You really haven't very well. It's a tough question. It relates to allies and the role the United States plays in the world globally. If Trump wins, I think you kind of have a feel for what American foreign policy has been like, and I actually think that it may become even more problematic. At the beginning of the Trump administration, a number of my colleagues, Republican friends, were arguing that, once president, he would be normalized by the system, that a lot of relationships with allies and others happen at the mid-levels of assistant secretaries, mill to mill, military to military cooperation alike. And that would all keep things, going fairly steadily. Well, I don't think that happened. And it'd probably be even less likely to happen in a second Trump administration. I know from being in Australia, people were concerned about his impetuousness, that there's some pushes on China that people agreed with, but the notion of being impetuous was of concern. So let me talk mostly about a Biden foreign policy. And again, I'll answer questions as you like about what might be Trump. And the main thing I want to make is it's not just about going back to a pre-Trump playbook. That there are many ways in which America's global role and the world in which we play that role were changing long before Donald Trump came along and pursued his America first. I think one of President Biden's first moves will be to reassure allies in terms of relationships that have been disrupted by President Trump. Trump's foreign policy never made it above the mid 40% for approval rating. But he kind of had this image of being, tough and all sorts of things, even though there weren't returns. And I have to relate a story because when I was in Melbourne, my wife and I, after spending a couple of days in Melbourne giving talks at Monash and University of Melbourne, we rented a car and drove out, the Great Ocean Road, and we were in Apollo Bay, taking a walk along the lovely coast. And I was wearing my Duke hat. Everybody knows our basketball team, and a Australian fellow came up to me and he said, "Oh, Duke University, I like your basketball team." And I said, "Yeah, we do too." And he asked me what I did, and I told him, and he said to me, "I like that guy Trump. The way he took on Kim Jong-un, that's what I really like, the North Korean leader." And I was like, well, actually, North Korea has developed more nuclear weapons, in the last 3-4 years than it had before. I didn't go there. I just stayed on basketball, and we kind of enjoyed the rest of our walk. But that image that Trump had of, assertive, has really, in many ways, drawn support from some people, at least in the United States and internationally. I think Biden will be in the first 100 days, he probably will go to Europe first. I suspect he will come to the Indo-Pacific during that first year. He will want to drive home the message that reassuring allies and also taking some distance from the kind of autocrats that President Trump has supported. Now, it's important to know that American foreign policy has never been pure. We really haven't lived up to our democratic values. Many of the leaders we supported, Suharto in Indonesia is one example, many in Latin America, were not exactly democratic during the Cold War. And we've supported leaders in the Middle East who shared our anti-terrorism, weren't exactly democratic. But Trump really took this to, I think, another dimension. So Biden will want to do that reassurance. And I think he probably will quickly want to reaffirm American commitments to some of the agreements that Donald Trump withdrew from. The Paris Climate Accord, which I'm pretty sure he can do just by executive action, doesn't need congressional action. And the so-called JCPOA, the Iran Nuclear Nonproliferation Agreement that the United States was a party to, along with European Union, Russia, China, and Iran. They'll want to reaffirm our commitments. And also to NATO. We didn't withdraw from NATO under President Trump, but we didn't exactly have great relations, not with Angela Merkel in Germany, not with Boris Johnson's predecessor, Theresa May. Macron started off trying to establish relations that didn't work out very well. But and the whole notion that NATO was really about, what percentage of the budget you paid, and a significant issue, but not the core issue of NATO. But in doing all three of those, he's going to have to go further than Barack Obama left things. It's been established at the Paris Climate Accord that even if all pledges were met, not just by the United States, we'd be at less than 50% of the emissions reductions needed to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise. China hasn't met its pledge. Russia hasn't. The EU's done a little bit better. And so the question really will be not just rejoining the Paris Accord, but will the United States play a leadership role on Paris Plus when the meeting happens in Glasgow in November 2021? And that will be very important, and it has all sorts of issues. I'll come back to those in a second, but it's not just going back to where Obama was. Similarly, the Iran agreement. We're, 5 years, almost 6 years into an agreement that had a 10-year time frame for some of the limitations, not that they'd be fully lifted, but they'd have to be readdressed. We're 5-6 years into it. So just to rejoin, and most analyses, including intelligence agencies prior to the American withdrawal from the agreement, weren't perfect, but largely affirmed that Iran was abiding by the agreement. But there was some discussion I know that I was a part of as Alistair said, I was involved in chairing one of the working groups in the Hillary Clinton campaign, that if we were to be elected, you couldn't just have a one-legged stool. That one of the lessons from efforts at détente with the Soviet Union in the 1970s was you couldn't just build it on strategic nuclear arms control. You were going to need to address some of the regional issues with Iran in the Middle East, Syria, and others, as well as the direct relationship, in order to give stability to that make it a three-legged stool, not a one-legged stool. I'm not saying Biden's going to immediately jump into that, but I think that will be the agenda, because the first step will be rejoining the agreement, assuming the Iranians are prepared to abide by IAEA and other inspections at that point. But you're going to, again, we're going to have to go further than Barack Obama left things. And similarly on NATO. We had differences within NATO before Trump. The Libya 2011 military intervention only involved a few NATO countries in the United States. There were differences over that. And the whole question that I wrote an article that we can send around in Foreign Affairs with a colleague called U.S. is Not Entitled Just to Global Leadership about a month ago. And we talked there about, it's really in the American interest not for NATO to break up, but for the Europeans to take a more active role in their own efforts to provide for their defense, both inside and outside NATO. So stop the bleeding, reassure allies, but you can't just go back to the pre-Trump playbook. And in many respects, if you think about it, the system that starts in 1945 and goes through the end of the 20th century, a little longer, in which the United States was really at the center of so many issues, not always in policies that folks might approve of, but at the center, was part of a particular distribution of power set of threats that we in the world faced at that time. The world's changed a lot in the third decade of the 21st century. China is a significant power, and that's not going to go away. We're going to talk about policies to address that. We have issues on the agenda like climate change, pandemic prevention. We talk about WMD, weapons of mass destruction. Well, we do need to talk about EMD, environmental mass destruction, and PMD, pandemic mass destruction. The pandemic has killed more people in the United States than our last 4 wars death toll combined in terms of Americans. And these are issues that are not just about one country. They're much more about trying to figure out ways to make collaborative and multilateral efforts work. And for people that believe in multilateralism, which Australian foreign policy is based upon it, we actually need to, be serious about trying to make it work better, because we have to acknowledge that there are many ways it hasn't been that effective. And so the goal becomes not to be pro or anti-multilateralism, the role of UN or other mechanisms, but to figure out how to make it work better for a lot of these issues. So we really have to think about what's the role for the United States in the third decade of the 21st century that has some elements of our prior role, but isn't just going back to that, because that just doesn't fit the world in which we live. So 2 or 3 points on that. And then we can really open up to a variety of other issues. In terms of China, when I was at ANU, I had the benefit of engaging with a number of great colleagues there who spent a lot of time working and thinking about these issues, as well as people in the government, that I was able to meet with while I was in Canberra. And I have some sense for, a variety of issues that are of concern to Australia, directly and indirectly. My view of what a Biden foreign policy in China should be to restrain and compete with China, but not go into a new Cold War. There was a lot of rhetoric in our campaign on both sides about who was soft on China, who was going to be tougher on China. China's going to play a role. It is a major power. We and you have our differences with Beijing, and they have been very assertive and aggressive in recent years, more so than before. But I don't think stability is just about U.S. dominance in the region. It's surely not about China's dominance. There's got to be some sort of equilibrium that maintains the stability and security in the region. And so that U.S. has a role to play militarily and diplomatically. We've found ways to cooperate with China before. We worked together on the Iran agreement. We worked together on the Copenhagen conference the Paris climate change conference, not the Copenhagen one. And the American public actually gets this. Recent poll data shows that the American public has become more critical of China, that the unfavorable view of China has gone up from 47% in 2016 to 73% this year. But when they're asked the follow-up question about whether China is a partner, enemy, or competitor, only 26% said enemy, and 57% were sticking to the competitor view. There was another poll that showed 55% that saw China as a threat, but 47% still favored friendly cooperation and engagement when possible. Even the China virus thing, the Americans haven't really bought into. There's many people that say Americans who don't socially distance is the cause of our COVID problems. I say that it's the Wuhan China virus. So I think we need a policy with China. And again, from my perspective, a lot of it has to do with what the Quad does together, but also what countries like Australia, India, and Japan and others in the region do with each other in terms of military cooperation, in terms of some diplomatic coordination. You put together the role that we play and the role that others play through their own independent foreign policies. And I think you have a policy that will restrain China in a variety of ways, but also will communicate to Beijing that the goal is not to isolate. We don't want to bipolarize the region. I don't think that is going to be stable by any stretch of the imagination. And so in some ways that's different than maybe in the Obama years where there was heavy emphasis on engagement. It's very different than the Trump policy, which has been trade wars and other things, which actually haven't worked that well to American advantage. But that's a really important point. And in some ways that speaks to our alliance in the Indo-Pacific in ways like I'm talking about Europe. We have a role to play. We're not retreating. But what the role is in this third decade of the 21st century is not necessarily the same as it was, in the second half of the 20th century. Similarly, in the Middle East, we have our two longest wars in history. To end those wars is not to withdraw from the Middle East. It's in many ways to think strategically about the role we need to play. Some of our relationships need some rethinking, particularly the relationship with Saudi Arabia. If you look at international terrorism, that the country that's most responsible for the terrorism that's affected the United States has been Saudi Arabia, not Iran. So there's a lot of what I've been talking about is recalibration of relationships to make them better fit the strategic realities. And my own sense, including from Australians, is that very few countries in the world want to be pushed to choose one or the other major power. That a lot prefer their relations with the United States to China. But look at Israel and Saudi Arabia. I mean, very close and got a whole lot from the Trump administration. They both have very active relations with China and with Russia. And I know Australia does, and even India, despite the clash in the Himalayas where they lost at least 20 Indian soldiers, they're still negotiating with China to try to work it out, as well as engaging in military cooperation with the Quad and with Australia and Japan. The one other issue I really want to mention on an ongoing basis is pandemic prevention. I think your own experience and New Zealand's experience really speak to this. You both have been, really pretty successful. The recent surge that happened, you've brought back down. But you both, that having the right domestic policy is necessary, but not enough for effectiveness. There has to be global cooperation. Otherwise, you can't let tourists in for, tourism industry. You can't leave and come back, et cetera. And this is an ongoing issue. COVID is a challenge. It's going to be one of Biden's highest priorities at home and abroad. I think he gets it that you don't withdraw from the WHO, but you work with it to reform. Measures that countries like Germany have been doing is helping increase the funding. The estimate I saw recently, I got to look it up here, was that that the WHO budget is about 1.5 days worth of the Pentagon's budget. Its annual budget, that is. And there are more pandemics to come. It's the nature of, global interconnectedness. And so I think for an issue that's affected the daily lives of more Australians and more Americans than any other issue, people who've died and lost loved ones, schools closing, the economy. This is an issue which has to be both good domestic policies and global. And I think it's a real opportunity, given the role we have played in prior pandemics, Ebola and Zika, as recent examples, for us to play the kind of global leadership diplomatic role that we played in many ways successfully in the 20th century. There are a lot of other aspects to it. It's not just the WHO, it's the global health security agenda. It's working with some of the coalitions of NGOs and companies to develop things, but that's really a lot of it. So I could go on, but I want to leave enough time for questions and discussion about any issue you'd like to talk about. Something I don't know about, I'll say so, but I'm happy to respond to what may be on your mind. So, Alistair, I'm happy to open up, and thank you very much.
Absolutely. Well, let's jump in. I'm just going to quickly, bear with me, change this view. There we go. So, Bruce, we've got a range of questions. A lot of them are about the election process, and then obviously foreign policy. So we might bounce around but between them both. But just following up on one of the points, Middle East, you talked about. What do you think a Biden administration approach would be to some of those critical issues? For example, the location of the U.S. embassy, talking Israel-Palestine, the war in Yemen, that type of thing.
Yeah, on the Israel issue, I don't think they'll undo the moving of the embassy. I think that, you can make an argument why they should, but the political capital involved would take away from other efforts. I don't think they're going to ignore the Palestinian issue like the Trump administration has. I mean, a lot of my time in government was working on Middle East issues. When I was in the Clinton State Department in 93, 94, was the Oslo Accords, was involved in those, and also the regional efforts to develop arms control and regional security throughout the region that actually even then involved Israel and about 15 Arab states. So I think it will make an effort, but and again, I go back to Yitzhak Rabin, who actually tomorrow is the 25th anniversary of his assassination. He would say that Israel cannot be sure that it will be secure with peace with the Palestinians, but we know we will never be secure without peace with the Palestinians. And I think that's a view that the Vice President Biden, potential President-elect Biden, holds. Now, how you do that, it's a fair criticism to say you can't go back to the same peace process that we did for the last 2 decades. I think they'll be creative on that. And there are disagreements with the Netanyahu government. I mean, they actively intervene in our politics to try to beat the Iran agreement. On other issues, with Saudi Arabia, there too, I mean, I think that there's a real fundamental rethinking. The reality is we're not as dependent on Middle East oil as we were decades before. Doesn't mean we want it to be disrupted, because it would affect allies and it would affect global financial markets. But the Saudis, in 2017, when they expelled Qatar from the Gulf Cooperation Council, we have one of our largest base in the Middle East is there. That wasn't in our interest. The Khashoggi thing is just beyond, it's hard to find the words that are critical enough. That it's a relationship, and they have been very much pro-Trump. So I think that's a relationship that you recalibrate. So there are other issues there as well, but anyway, that's a couple of Middle East ones.
Yeah, that's it. I was going to pitch on my own question. You talked about the role that the US has to play diplomatically. One of the accusations leveled at the Trump administration is that the State Department has been hollowed out in many respects. And I don't know how long it would take to sort of rebalance that, but do you think a Biden administration would take a different view?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I think you're right, Alistair. It actually goes deeper. I can tell you as a professor. So I would tell people when I was getting out of college in the 70s, if you're interested in international affairs, you went on for a PhD, you joined the Peace Corps, or you joined the Foreign Service, right? And I joke that actually when I first graduated I just, went to Europe, bought a van and traveled for a year, but that's its own story. But then I did go back to grad school. My students today have a lot of options, including the NGO world, as ANU and other students do. And if they choose the NGO world, it's not because they're getting more money than the State Department. It's because they feel like they could make more difference. So I've been involved in discussion with the State Department going back to when Colin Powell even tried as Secretary of State to try to get some reforms of the Foreign Service. We have a lot of work to do to make it attractive to people that are not just undoing what Trump did. And I think if we're serious about the kind of Foreign Service that we had in the great days of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we have to really invest in it and make it attractive to this next generation and compete with other opportunities they have to have an impact in international affairs.
Just looking more widely, I guess, at the impact potentially on US soft power, do you think there's a risk that the way Trump has discredited the electoral system and that the polarization that's come out in the electorate through that, is that going to damage the appeal of democracy in other parts of the world and have a negative impact on US soft power?
Absolutely. You know, as you can see, a lot of my theme is not just what Trump's done, but it's ways in which we've had problems that were there before him that we would have had to deal with if Hillary Clinton. So on this point, you know, I think, you know, an OECD study done in 2014, again, pre-Trump, the United States came out 33rd out of 37 countries on basic social justice indicators, public education, health, a variety of other factors, you know, public transportation. So if we're serious about the attractiveness of the American model, we've got a lot of work to do and not just not do what Trump did. On, you know, on democracy there too, again, I'm going to be critical of policies I was a part of, but also of the Cold War period. We tended to be more supportive of principles when it intersected with our strategic and power interests. So we're all for, you know, Soviet dissidents like Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn. But in Latin America and in much of Asia, our definition of democracy was too often ABC, anybody but communists. And we had a very broad definition of what a communist was, nationalists and so on. So there too, I think if President Biden were to really want to say that we're for democracy, we've got to really mean it. Otherwise, you know, people will say, maybe you're better than the other. The other point I'll make is one of his proposals is for a summit of the democracies. It's one I actually don't agree with. First of all, if you're going to sit down and plan that, of course, Australia and New Zealand be invited, but some of these countries, do you invite Turkey? Do you invite Hungary? Number one. Number two is, I don't think the world is democracies versus autocracies. You know, Russia and China are doing some collaborating, but again, in the late, we didn't pay enough attention to the Sino-Soviet split. And so the notion of grouping them. And number three is we've proven that we can work with autocracies. We did with the Soviet Union, we have with China. So I feel like, you know, the democracy thing can make good speeches, but when you think it through as strategy, it doesn't work as well.
Maybe we can jump to the election because it's
okay.
First up, do you think there has been any substantial foreign interference this time around? Is there a feeling about that?
I'm sure there has been, but I think that it doesn't seem to be as evident. There's a very interesting article that I saw in the paper the other day that's worth seeing if there's a follow-up, that US Cyber Command in the last week or two did some very proactive operations, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, whomever. I have a feeling they made that decision within their own command structure. It wasn't asked for by the White House. But there doesn't seem to be, you know, there is some in the whole Facebook question, you know, there's things that go out, because it does relate actually to one other part of your question. I mean, the whole, you know, Black Lives Matter movement we had in this country this summer, again, it's much deeper. In the 60s, we made enormous progress on race relations led by Martin Luther King Jr. And then since then, we really have not very well. And many institutions in the United States, universities, businesses, are really finally starting to take these issues more seriously. But a lot of the, you know, the Russian disinformation was to exploit those differences. And I do think it's fed into what we refer to as our white nationalist movements. And these are the most, I was driving through a rural part of North Carolina, Virginia last weekend, and I saw these caravans of pickup trucks with these giant flags there. And again, I know every country has its issues of diversity and dealing with different constituent parts of its country, but that's a huge issue, and that's what's been feeding some of the violence. You know, we had white nationalists plotting to kidnap the governor of Michigan, and so those kind of things I think are very important for America to feel. We don't need to be perfect out there, but I think what we really need to do is show not just that, hey, we're better than Russia or China, but that we're really trying to be better all the time. To make a more perfect union is the expression Vice President Biden uses a lot.
And just quickly on some of President Trump's threatened challenges to the legitimacy of voting in some of these states, do you think there is any legal standing that he will get the Supreme Court to follow up on some of those issues?
Has to go through a lot of steps before it gets to the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court ruled in the Gore versus Bush, it had gone through a lot of steps. And I'm not a lawyer, but there are a lot of judges that have gotten appointed in various levels of the courts over the years, not just by Trump. Senator McConnell has been particularly adept at making this happen. And I'm sure they're going to find a couple judges that are going to make decisions they like. The Democrats have got, some tough lawyers that are working these issues. And he's done it before. I mean, part of the damage to the democracy is not just what we're seeing now, but has been this fundamental violation of core norms and institutions. And it's hard for any democracy to fully come back from that. It's like somebody said facetiously, the next president lied only 10% of the time, we would think it's an improvement. And we don't want our presidents to lie. So I am worried about the next couple of months, as I said at the outset, and we'll just have to see.
Okay. Just a couple of some more geopolitical issues. If there were a Biden administration, just some of the other stances they might take that would affect Australia. Firstly, climate change. Do you think there would be pressure on Australia to engage more with the Paris Agreement?
I hope so. I arrived in January, in the bushfires, but we did a lot of traveling through the countryside, and I know you have some sense. I really think that this is an issue. Again, I can say, in a couple articles I wrote lately, you really see the difference in the American politics. It's not just a Democratic issue. There's a lot of support. It's, we're in the Greek alphabet now for named hurricanes this season, right? We went through our whole alphabet, and people are seeing the effects in a very real way. And the politics are really changing. You have some climate change deniers, even in the financial community, by virtue of investments and some government incentives, the actual cost of wind power and solar power have gone down tremendously. Even auto efficiency, when the Obama administration first proposed to the auto companies to go from about 37 miles per hour for fleet average, I might be wrong on the figures, to 54, they were no. And they actually found they could do it. And when Trump said you don't have to do it anymore, some of the big auto companies said, actually, we're actually okay on that technology. So I actually think it's in all of our interests. I know coal and I know oil here and coal in the United States, but this is, we throw around the word existential threat. This is an existential threat, and and the amount of time. That's why the Paris Agreement is not just the U.S., but even if those pledges were met, less than 50% of what we need. So I really believe we can find a lot of win-wins here for countries and for the mix of economic interests and environmental interests.
Looking back at closer to our region here, any feeling how a Biden administration might approach China's assertiveness in the South China Sea, and there's a sort of follow-on question just on status of Taiwan, how they would view Taiwan if China is becoming more expansionist minded.
Yeah, I think Taiwan is a long-standing American commitment, and so I think it'd be important that for American credibility that we abide by that. But I think that the Trump administration has been very provocative. The nature of the weaponry they've been selling to Taiwan during their transition, accepting phone calls from the Taiwanese. I feel like that, the Kissinger, Zhou Enlai agreement of 1972, not bad, almost 50 years it's held up. And so I think we need to affirm that and continue to look for a peaceful resolution of the issue. My own sense is that, for all his proclamations of lifetime president, I think Xi Jinping may be finding out that he's been overreaching a lot. I'll get to South China Sea in a second, but look at Britain. in Huawei. Britain resisted American pressures to not do Huawei 5G. Even Boris Johnson resisted. But it changed it, not because of the Trump administration, but because of Hong Kong, right? And if China were to violate the notion of peaceful resolution of Taiwan, the consequences for, I think this is one thing that the international community would be fairly, allied on, and what form it would take, and not just sanctions, but I think businesses would pull back. So I think that there's some aspects there to work with. I think that maybe, like a lot of countries, the Belt and Road Initiative now is getting a lot of pushback around the world. Many countries are saying, I mean, you have cases like Sri Lanka and Malaysia that kind of got locked in some, some indebtedness, but a lot of countries are saying, wait, we had the European and colonialists, we had the American and Soviet superpowers. We don't want to be dominated by you in that way. And so the notion that's leading to Chinese hegemony or dominance is there. On the South China Sea, I think it's been important to ensure that China doesn't get to determine who has rights of passage. My sense, and I think not everybody, likely Biden administration would agree with this, that the notion of America maintaining military predominance in the South China Sea is not going to be stable. It's just not. And, I can understand that from China's point of view. We get worried. We have our Monroe Doctrine going way back in the Western Hemisphere. Now, Chinese predominance is also not stable. And so how you find what back in the détentés was called the central equivalence between us and the Soviet, how you work that out, I think, is very important. And maybe China's not willing to work it out, but I would surely think it's worth, trying to explore that in the right kind of way. And I think we would do that in a way in consultation with all of our Indo-Pacific allies to make sure that everybody's interests were taken care of.
Just following on from that, how important is the Quad as a specific construct to the US?
I think it's very important. I think it works pretty well. And as does Five Eyes, but there too, I think that, the Quad is important, but I don't think any country that's a member, and you guys can speak for Australia, necessarily wants it to be an anti-China alliance, right? A balancer, yes. And some of the measures that you all have worked out directly with Japan and India and tripartite, I think, are also important. So you put those together, you start to have the elements of security and stability in the region that aren't sort of the hub and spokes model with the United States, doing it. Because, the demands, because of pandemic and elsewhere, we have a lot of demands on our resources. And, I think the Pentagon's gonna have to do some rethinking, not because we're withdrawing from the world, but, and so to the extent that we're working together as friends and allies, we can achieve the same objective in a way that fits with countries' own interest in having a certain degree of strategic autonomy. I know a lot of discussion about that in Australia.
I'm just going to jump back now to the election question. Do you think Biden's presidential chances were weakened by some of the attacks or the negative campaigning during the primaries? I mean, not least from Kamala Harris, who was pretty fiercely opposed to some of his previous policies.
I don't think so. It's interesting. So I will tell you, and people were there at my lecture at ANU in the mid-March when just emerging in January, February, and I've got great respect for Vice President Biden. I've never worked for him, but I've had the opportunities to work with him. His hometown of Pennsylvania is where my mother was from. I mean, all sorts of things. But I think he was not a strong candidate. He came very close, and I talk about this in the people are interested, the paper I did in the Center of Gravity series for ANU on foreign policy in the election. I mean, I started it there and I, finished it, last couple of weeks. He got very close to being knocked out in January and February. And three things happened when the South Carolina primary came around and the African-American Congressman, James Clyburn, endorsed Biden. Endorsements sometimes don't mean much. That meant a huge amount. The other was others had dropped out. Then it was between Biden and Bernie Sanders. And there was a lot, Elizabeth Warren, I think, could attract support from more elements of the party. There's a lot of anti-Bernie element. And so that dichotomized it. And then I think COVID, in some ways, really fit his candidacy. He didn't have to be out there all the time. It wasn't safe, because he had shown in the primaries he wasn't that good at the retail campaigning that we go through for months, years. And the notion of the anti-Trump, somebody who took science seriously, who had a plan, who tried to model. I mean, I said to somebody the other day, I was being interviewed by a journalist, said, to me, one of the worst things about COVID, in addition to all of the terrible 4% of the world population, 22% of the world deaths, it's an incredible missed opportunity. Where if we had decided, we talk about we can't do things together as a country. We'd been in this together. We worked on it. Masks didn't get as politicized. I know they were partly politicized in Australia too, but they got so politicized here. And every night on TV and on the internet, you saw charts, how we were doing. Not so we got complacent. What a great opportunity. We might have turned around and said, wow, we really can work together as a diverse society. What else can we do? I think Biden will try to inculcate that a bit more. So I think in some ways he was the contrast to Trump, especially on COVID, and reassuring more than other figures would have been. So the other stuff just got superseded by COVID.
And Kamala Harris, I mean, there now is potentially VP. How is she viewed by the public?
Very positively. I mean, her campaign was unsuccessful. I've been through a lot of these campaigns and have lost a lot and won some, including within the party. I think she was trying to be all things to all people initially, and it just didn't work. But she's been a very powerful part of the ticket. She attracted quite a bit of money. I think she did extremely well in her debate with Vice President Pence. She was a law enforcement officer and attorney general. And is both South Asian and African American immigrant family, has done very well. And I think what you'll see in this administration is Vice President Biden, as he said, when Barack Obama asked me to be vice president, he only asked for one thing, which is, I want to be the last person in the room to talk with you. And Kamala Harris keeps saying the same thing. So Biden knows what it means to use your vice president, not just to go send them off to do something and never talk to them. So, we'll see how she performs, but I think she's off to a really, really good start.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, just jumping back to Europe and the UK. I mean, the UK always claimed a special relationship. I mean, how do you see things developing? Post Brexit, is there going to be more of a focus onto continental Europe, perhaps?
I think both. So I was in June 2016. I was at Chatham House giving an invited talk that was supposed to be on foreign policy in our election then, and Brexit vote happened 2 days before, and I was like, maybe you guys should tell me what's going on. But I often said that was the same week that England lost to Iceland in the European Cup, and if you went in a pub, people were much more upset about that. I think that the Biden administration will, Trump encouraged. Is there a chance to rethink Brexit? After, I don't know. That's a UK issue, but we'll have relations with both, and I think we'll try to keep them surely integrated in a common European foreign and security policy as well as in NATO. But the notion that, and there were negatives to the Tony Blair-George Bush relationship, vis-a-vis Iraq. I don't think it'll be. I think the world has changed. I don't think that will be that notion that we think of the British first before we think of the other Europeans.
There was one question which is not necessarily needing an answer right now, but someone was asking if you had any recommended reading about US policy and geopolitics. As I was going to suggest, when we send the link to the recording out, we'll perhaps attach the link to your center of gravity article, but I might follow up separately with you offline in case there are any recommendations, and we can send that out as a separate.
Yeah, I will say that it actually footnotes a couple articles that I've done lately that go beyond that issue. One was on how to think about pandemic and climate change as a global issue, and the other was on America's global role. So foreign affairs, if people can get behind the paywall, has been compiling lots of different articles. I think those are really good. The Brookings Institution is always putting things out. So I think those are good. Foreignpolicy.com, which I think does now have a paywall as well, on a daily basis, gives you good reports. Those are a good smattering for the debates. And the debate will turn, again, if there's a Biden administration, to now not just, Biden-Trump, it'll be the progressive wing and the more traditionalist wing, and people will see a lot of that back and forth.
Okay, well, thank you. We'll send a link out to a couple of those things. I'm keeping an eye on our time because I know it's getting late on for your evening, but maybe we can get a couple of last ones in.
Sure.
Quickly on the WHO, that's had a lot of flack from Trump. How different do you think Biden approach might be to the WHO?
Very, very different. I think we worked with the WHO on Ebola and Zika. I think the WHO needs a lot of reform. And there are some criticisms that are fair criticisms about the ways that, back when China had SARS in 2003, the head of the WHO was Gro Harlem Brundtland, the former prime minister of Norway. And she worked out a way of having China save face, but getting the information out. And I think that's the mistake that the head of the WHO made this time. The crucial issue there is what's called the International Health Regulations that were enacted in the mid-2000s, which, are, not full commitments, but countries pledged to share information. I think those need to be more enforceable. I think we all need to agree because, did China really benefit from not sharing the information? They're paying a price too. And then there are other aspects. There are different coalitions, the Global Health Security Agenda. We had a number of our USAID people in Wuhan working in the labs. Trump had pulled them out. So it's not just the WHO, it's really what your global health, pandemic prevention, overall geopolitical strategy is. That's a part of it, but it's not the only part.
Well, thank you very much. I'm thinking we've really pretty much filled our hour, Bruce. We have not got through all the questions, but I think we've covered, well, most of them in gist, if not in detail. So I think with a view to the fact your evening is getting late, we're probably not going to get through many more details. So I think I just take the opportunity to thank you very much for sharing your time and thoughts and insights. Thank all the audience very much for their interest, and we will continue to watch those Electoral College votes come in. So I hope you don't have too much more of a second restless night there, Bruce. But
we'll see. No, tonight should be okay. Well, thank you too. All the best to everybody there, maybe some old friends and colleagues, and good luck to all of you as well.
Absolutely. Good. Well, good on you. Thank you very much, Bruce, and we'll stay in touch. Thanks to everybody.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.